So I apologize if this is trying the patience of some of you, but I'm going to continue to reflect on the debate I've been having as an evolutionary panpsychist, as I call it, with, uh, let's say, physicalist emergentism, right? So I'm debating the view that what we call human consciousness is or was at some point emergent from a merely material substrate, and that when consciousness emerged, that's when things like meaning and value and feeling and intelligence entered into the universe, and that before that emergence of consciousness, none of that existed. There was just molecules in motion, molecules and atoms and energy and space time. That's what there was. And then mind emerges, and after that point, all the things that we think of as like consciousness and intentionality and will and purpose, all those things came at that point. Now, some emergentists will say that this happens when the nervous system becomes sufficiently complex. Other emergentists will say that it happens when the first living cell uh, self assembles out of a soup of uh, thermodynamic chemical reactions, right? It's with life that you get simple sentience that gradually evolves into consciousness. And, um, so whether we say it's with complex nervous systems or with cellular organization, autopoiesis, as the Chilean school refers to it, um, that's when sentience and eventually consciousness emerges. The panpsychist, that's me, what what we are arguing is that yes, these more complex forms of self-organization emerge in the course of evolutionary history, but that in order to understand this evolutionary history, we need to presuppose some sort of um, experiential interiority, some desire, right? Or feeling, some modicum of subjectivity must be present from the very beginning of this evolutionary process in order to understand how it could arrive through a continuous process of iteration at something like us, human beings, conscious beings who, do science and are religious and artistic. If we are to explain our own consciousness in a, I think, coherent and consistent way, given the available empirical evidence, we would want to do so in a way that is, in some way, continuous, that there's a sort of genetic continuity from the earliest to the latest forms of self organization. And so the panpsychist says, yes, there are these forms of individuation, the emergence of a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Atoms, right, as the emergence out of protons and neutrons and electrons of a greater whole, a stable whole with new powers and capacities. And then the emergence out of atoms of an even more complex whole, like a star, and the emergence out of stars, of galaxies, and the way that biological self-organization, beginning with a single cell, becoming multicellular, uh, developing nervous systems and language, um, you end up with an evolutionary story that is fully naturalistic, but that also accounts for the emergence of spirit, because we're recognizing that nature from the beginning was a creative and purposeful process. Now, the alternative, which is a form of physicalism, and some of the emergentists I've been debating have said, don't call me a materialist, that's a pejorative. And it's like, okay, but my position has been that I actually think eliminative materialism is the more rigorous, like intellectually rigorous position. So I'm almost saying materialism isn't a pejorative. Like, I think we should take it seriously and as a valid position, and not dismiss it as like rude or um, too harsh or something. Like, no, go full on with the reductionism. If you want to say consciousness is emergent from matter and that matter is a deterministic mechanical process, and that if you want to say that consciousness doesn't add anything to the deterministic playing out of the mechanisms of nature, if you want to say that even we human beings are just part of nature and gene machines struggling in a fixed environment of scarce resources to make copies of ourselves, like if that's what human beings ultimately are, then we've got to start figuring out how to accept the moral consequences of that truth. And I think the eliminative materialist position is really facing up to that, whereas there's this other sort of emergentist position that says, well, no, consciousness isn't just an epiphenomenon. It actually can change what's happening. It changes the behavior of the organism which possesses it or which is possessed by it. So that consciousness plays a role in evolution. And David Long, who I've been debating on this question for a couple weeks now, has he shared a video on his Facebook page. I'd love to be able to participate in the dialogue on his page on Facebook, but I'm not allowed. My views are dangerous and so much must be censored. I don't mean to be inflammatory by saying that. It's just what's happening. But I'm recording this video. I'm not claiming that I have been silenced. I clearly have freedom of speech and am able to say what I think about this and be heard. So I'm just saying I wish I could engage directly with David, and maybe he and I will engage at a later time. But David shared this video, and I actually want to play a few minutes of it here. It's called "The Origin of Consciousness: How Unaware Things Become Aware," and it's on this channel called Kurds Gesagt in a Nutshell. So I'll post a link to it, but listen in here.
Take a stone. The consensus is that a stone is not conscious, though not everyone agrees even on this. Some panpsychists claim that a lump of rock may have an inner life. However, there are no real grounds for any such assumption, since stones never show behavior. Their inner life can neither be proven nor disproven.
So stones never show behavior, so their inner life can't be proven or disproven. So what this video, this guy who's making this video is implying there, then, I think, is that we know that consciousness exists in human beings and maybe complex animals because of a certain patterns of behavior that seem to indicate that there might be some interiority there. But I think he would have to admit, based on his premises here, that at any scale of nature or complexity, at any scale of nature's complexity, we're only going to have behavior. And so we're never going to be able to prove whether there is consciousness or isn't consciousness. So if we are then to go on to tell a story of, the evolutionary elaboration of this capacity for consciousness, wherein, we say that rocks don't have it, but these organisms with metabolism, organisms with hunger that need to eat, right, to take in free energy and produce entropy, that for these organisms, some sort of sentience emerges, and all of a sudden there's this consciousness thing that has a function evolutionarily, which is to help this creature find food, and then later to help it mate, and to do all sorts of interesting things. It starts with hunger, right? And so this video, I could just go on and play it, but this is the basic idea here, and I'll just do that because David shared this video when he was asked for, an explanation of emergence, a scientific explanation of how consciousness can emerge from minerals, molecules, right? How do you get motivated organisms out of the motion of molecules, right? That's the question here. And this is the answer given in the video that David shared.
A more common starting point is with living things. A living thing, or a self, is a part of the universe that sustains itself and makes more of its kind. To do so, it needs energy. And this is where an awareness of the world comes in handy. The original function of consciousness was probably to direct a mobile self that was short of energy to a fresh supply of food.
Okay, the original function of consciousness was to help this organism eat. So this is the explanation that consciousness originally served a function for certain organisms that needed to navigate an environment and find food. So so this is given as an explanation, but I didn't. Maybe you heard it. Maybe I missed it. The explanation for how function, the function of consciousness, is there in this physical system called a biological organism. Um, and whereas before there weren't functions, there were just physical happenings, right? There was just stuff colliding, right? The geometrical tumbling of mathematically determined, um, you know, relations. So, but then something like a function emerges, and then just a simple function of yum and yuck, a feeling of yum and yuck that serves the function of helping organisms get food, and you're off and running, right? And then the story from there, right, is uh, the complexification of life as this capacity for consciousness elaborates itself. And that's great. I'm totally on board with that process of emergence and, the evolutionary unfolding from simple sentience to symbolic consciousness. But it's this beginning step, this original function of consciousness. Can you, if this is an explanation, go a little bit slower for me and tell me again how molecules self-assemble and become capable of being motivated, having hunger. That's a leap, and I haven't actually heard the logical scientific account of how function emerges, right? That's the question. That's why the problem of consciousness is so hard. I'm not denying that there is a evolutionary advantage to, being able to direct ourselves toward energy, toward food, right? And that desire for energy can be harnessed by the evolutionary process so as to bring forth even more complex expressions of desire that are capable of all these things, like not only spatial comprehension and awareness, but temporal comprehension, sensitivity in space and time, maybe even transcendent sensitivities, transcendental at least, where we feel into spaces of possibility not yet actualized in space and time. Um, so, what is consciousness? It's not merely behavior, right? It's also intent. It's not merely extension in space, it is intention in time, in evolutionary time. And yes, consciousness evolved, but my claim as the evolutionary panpsychist is that it's been evolving, it's been unfolding since the beginning of space-time and matter energy. It's always been here, and we are an expression of that experiential energy that's always been here. Otherwise, we're positing a sort of unnecessary epiphenomenalism or an incoherent dualism. And I've laid out the reasons for that elsewhere. I'll attach a link to a journal article about this, and this is what I began my debate with David trying to explain, that philosophically or ontologically, emergence leaves us in a situation where either we're epiphenomenalists, which in that case, why not just be eliminative materialists? If there's a ghost that does nothing and matters not for the machine, Or we're a dualist, in which case you're just as bad as the supernaturalist creationist that you pretend to be attacking. So, I think in this attempted explanation for the emergence of consciousness, I didn't actually hear an explanation. So again, I would ask those who would defend the emergentist point of view, I ask for an account of how it is that molecules imagined as like mere extensional lumps of stuff that collide with one another, how that becomes sentience, or how that becomes motivated to do anything. How does energy decide that it wants to eat itself, that it wants to eat itself, and that that want could serve a function in an evolutionary process? That's the question. I didn't hear an explanation for that in this video that David shared. And if that's the theory, I'd really love to understand it better. So maybe another link to a better video would help.